All right. Hi, Matt Sitter here, CEO of AFN. At AFN, our fundamental belief is that change is where opportunity happens. And the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. So when we put our events on, we bring in a subject matter expert to broaden our perspective around things. Today, we've got Kirsty McKerrow with us. She is founder and MD of the Edinburgh Whisky Academy and a personal friend. Kirsty, it's good to see you.
Yes. Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about the whiskey industry generally, just learning a little bit about that, but also hopefully we all get the opportunity to enjoy a little whiskey here and there. It's 9 o'clock in the morning for me, so I will not be partaking right now, but Kirsty will be able to give us some tidbits on how we should think about whiskey and what are the do's and don'ts around it. Kirsty, maybe just to start off, how'd you get into the industry and how'd you end up in your current position?
So I had quite sort of convoluted entry into the industry because I had been working as a paramedic, but we'd moved over to Scandinavia and ended up in Sweden where my tickets didn't transfer. So Sweden's a really whiskey sort of very enthusiastic country for whiskey, particularly Scotch. So, and I have a slight Scotch background in that my mother's side of the family started two distilleries in the early 1800s and produced McKinley's blended malt. And then my father, when I was growing up, he was the chief executive of Glenmorangie. So I sort of knew a bit about Scotch whiskey. And so in Sweden, I set up my own whiskey tasting business. We were living in a ski town. So I used to do tastings for corporate groups that came up for team building and also just fun, family groups that were up for a week skiing. And from that, I got offered the job with Hennessy to be the brand ambassador for Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, which I absolutely loved. And then it was obviously during my time there that I really was looking for whiskey training courses because I got great brand training from Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, but I really wanted to improve my foundational knowledge on the process of Scotch whiskey making. And I was really quite disillusioned by the courses that were on the market at that time. So when we came back to Scotland, I decided to really put my energy and my focus into creating the Edinburgh Whisky Academy and giving whiskey education the sort of status and attention that I felt it deserved. And that was back in 2015. So, and we're still here going strong. So it's great.
Good stuff. When you're thinking about the industry generally, I mean, alcoholic beverages, the tastes are changing quite a bit in different parts of the world. What are some of the big changes that you're seeing out there in terms of who's consuming, what they want to drink, what they want to know about what they're drinking as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the sort of consumer landscape has changed a lot. Consumers are much more knowledgeable. They're much more discerning now. I mean, whiskey tastings really didn't start until the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And at that point, it was very much, you just told them what to taste or what to look out for. And that was all absorbed. Whereas now people are questioning, well, how do we get this flavor? How is this coming about? So I think everything's been elevated a level, and also the diversity within the audience. There's much more female drinkers. There's been a big push, which is great. We've got a lot of in Scotland. We've got a lot of female master blenders. The whole dynamic of it being a man's drink, that's sort of gone. So that's fantastic. And then also there's the sort of versatility of Scotch because previously it was sort of frowned upon to put it in a cocktail or add it with a mixer. But now there's lots of brands that are actually producing whiskey specifically for this. So I think it's changing a lot. And there's loads going on. And obviously there's also the big side of cask investment, which is quite a contentious side over here in Scotland because there's lots of promises being made over your investment will go up by X%. And so we'll see what happens with that because that's perhaps something that we'll see how that goes over the next few years.
So can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean when you say cask investment? What who's investing? What are they investing in?
So, so you buy casks. So before, if you had 10 years ago, if you had bought a couple of casks off, Macallan or Ardbeg, you'd be laughing because they're worth so much money now. So people who have historically bought casks have made a lot of money. Now, with all the stock shortages and the increase in value in whiskey stocks, cask investment companies have been set up, and there are quite a few that are very reputable and will give you good advice. But there are a few that perhaps exaggerate the gains. The idea being that if you buy a cask now and you keep it for 10 years and then you sell it either to another investor, you probably wouldn't bottle it because of all the additional costs that you'd incur. You could either sell it back to the distillery, or you can sell it to an independent bottler, or to someone else who wants to buy a cask. There are lots of claims of how much your money can go up, and it's very much disputed that will actually happen. So I think it would go up. It's just that people need to be made aware of the pitfalls as well as the sort of success stories.
Sure. Okay, so how big is a cask? Just out of curiosity.
So it varies. By law in Scotland, it can't be bigger than 750 litres. So they're normally around about 250, but if you dependent on what cask you get, could be up to 400 or 500 litres.
Okay. And then, these investment companies that are out there, are they taking care of where the things are stored, making sure they're climate controlled, all that stuff as well?
Yeah, so I think so. A lot of them, if you buy it from a distillery, you will pay a little bit extra just to keep it at the distillery. So this is all like in the package. But I think, from what I believe, the cask investment takes care of everything. The company, sorry. And obviously you pay a premium for that. But like I say, there are a couple of companies out there that are very well respected and would definitely recommend going with them. But then, like with everything, there's a few that are perhaps less
A little more
well
dodgy.
respected.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and you've mentioned before that, Scottish whiskey in particular has grown a lot in consumption in Asia. What do you think's behind that?
I think I'm not sure, but I think they love the tradition of Scotch. They love the premium aspect of it. It's really hard. I mean, you couldn't replicate the Scotch whiskey industry because everything takes so long. Even the whiskey takes 10 years to mature and stuff. So I think it's that aspect. And it's really that when Scotch single malt was being positioned as a category in its own right during the 70s and early 80s, it was done in such a way that it really focused on the craft, and it then created this sort of status and platform from which it really grew. So I think it's that status has gone on and on. And a lot of the bigger companies here, they have expressions that are specifically targeted to the Asian market, which is very premium. It's all, sort of much higher end. And I think that's just also, I think Asians probably have quite a lot of money to spend on Scotch. But I think it's primarily the tradition and the status that goes with being either a Scotch whiskey drinker or a Scotch whiskey collector.
A lot of the brands that are out there in other types of alcohol are owned by singular companies, right? Like you got Diageo owning a whole bunch of brands around it. How true is that of Scotch whiskey? How consolidated is it?
Quite. I mean, obviously we've got Diageo, who I think have 29 single malt distilleries, and it's not so bad. I mean, Bacardi have quite a few. Brown-Forman obviously have bought a couple more recently. So it's actually not the key ones are not necessarily the big ones. William Grant's has the #1 selling Scotch, and they've got 3 different single malts, Scotch single malts. So it's not that dominated in terms of the direction it goes in. I think that some people do feel that innovation can be slightly stifled because if the big boys don't want to do it, then it, you know, takes a lot longer, or it doesn't get the sort of airtime that it could do. But equally, the amount that they have invested in ensuring the growth of the category, really establishing it as a strong category, like, you know, now we're talking about the interest from Asia, you know, that all came from a lot of hard work from these distilleries, you know, 20, 30 years ago. They're also very good at implementing stock sort of changeover, so that we hopefully don't get the situation where there's too much stock. It's all prepared and laid down for further down the line. So there's always that fine balance of, you know, demand and supply. So I think it varies. I mean, people do get sometimes a little bit frustrated, because with Diageo, so many of their really nice single malt distilleries, they only go into blends. So it's really hard to get a bottle of it as a single expression. And I know that frustrates a lot of people, because some of those distilleries produce amazing whiskey, but they need it all for their blends. So it's sort of pluses and minuses.
Well, and you mentioned shortages before. What's behind shortages of certain whiskeys that are out there? Is it a lot more people are after it right now? Is it planned shortages? How is that working?
So I think at the moment there's very little stock movement, and that's, I think it's just it's been so popular, and with the time it takes, you know, all distilleries over the last, or most distilleries over the last 2-3 years have been doubling their production, doubling their warehousing space. Wow. But you know, that takes a while, one, to do, and then they have to create the spirit, and then it has to stay in the cask for however long they want it. So there's going to be much less shortage coming up, but I think it's also there's quite high tariffs in India at the moment, or there has been, and there is apparently chat around the fact that these tariffs might be reduced, and then that will open up an insane market for Scotch, because it's such a big market, but it's the tariffs make it prohibitive for anyone to sort of buy Scotch single malt. So I from what I hear, quite a lot of distilleries are holding back some stock in the hope that this will happen, and then they will have available stock to just go out. Wow.
Okay. Well, and so, you know, the interesting thing, we compare this against, like, let's say beer, right? So you want to produce more beer, you can do it pretty rapidly, but you want to produce more Scotch whiskey, it's going to take a little time. You threw around 10 years, but like from when you decide, hey, we're going to start this next batch to when it is actually consumed by people, how long of a period of time is that?
Well, I think it depends on the age you want to, or how, if it's going to have an age. It depends on when you're going to bottle it. The actual distillation process wouldn't take more than, you know, a week or so, depending on how long your fermentation is. But then it's in the cask, and sometimes they may plan to release it after 8 years, but taste it and say, actually, this isn't quite ready. It needs a bit longer, or sometimes it may be the other way. Equally, they may be planning to blend it with different whiskies and bottle it as a blended malt, and then could have a no age statement. So it really depends on how long they want to keep it in the cask and what their plans to do with it are.
Okay. And so when they actually are putting on the bottle, the age of it, that's how long it's sat in the cask for.
Yeah. So that's, okay. And if it's a blended whiskey, the age on the label would be the age of the youngest whiskey in that blend. Okay.
Gotcha. Well, so as we're thinking about, you know, our own personal preferences around these things, what are the big things that differentiate different types of whiskey, you know, be it color, smell, taste, you know, what are some of the big things that we should be looking out for?
Well, so primarily it's the type, so if it's a grain whiskey, a malt, a single malt, a blended malt, or a blended whiskey, and that will relate back to the ingredients that has gone into it, and also the way it's been distilled, the way it's been processed. So that's sort of, obviously, single malt has, or a blended malt has only 3 ingredients, which is malted barley, water, and yeast. Whereas if you have a grain whiskey or a blended whiskey, then other grains can be in that, and there's a different distillation process that can be used. But when you get to the whiskey, so yeah, I mean, it's the age on the label obviously is quite important, but the color normally can give you a great indication of the type of cask used. But don't forget that by law, Scotch distillers can add caramel colouring, which does not add any flavour. It's purely for consistency of batch after batch. So sometimes, a lot of the time, if they don't add colouring, they will say that on the label, but they're not obliged to say that they do add colouring. So don't sort of put too much faith in the colour. But yeah, so basically you're just looking for the nose, really important. If you add some water, it often opens it up, particularly if it's a cask strength whiskey. So if it's sort of 50% and above, then adding in a drop of water will open up those flavours and make it slightly more accessible for people to identify the different aromas and flavours. And then it's really just to enjoy it. There's sort of primarily 3 different phases. There's the primary, and then the taste, and then the finish. And so if you were to analyse it, then that would sort of be the way to go. But obviously dependent on the cask, if it's a sort of sherry matured whiskey, then you'll be looking for much more like Christmassy, spicy notes, flavours like, and aromas that were around all the time now because it's Christmas. So lovely sort of cloves and spices and rich fruit cake. Whereas if it's a bourbon matured whiskey, you'll tend to get much sweeter, more vanilla, sort of coconutty notes, and those are sort of 2 key differences.
Okay, so when you said you literally said a drop of water being added will open it up. Is that literally how much? Like how much water should you put in if you're sipping something to be able to get that benefit?
It depends. If you're having a whiskey for enjoyment with your friends, you can add as much as you like. My dad adds, sort of 1/3 whiskey to probably, 2/3 water, and he has it as a long drink and loves it. Whereas, so if it's for enjoyment, then there is no right or wrong at all. But if you're trying to do a sort of sensory comparison or analysis, then it's recommended just a few drops to open it up. Obviously, if there's a stronger ABV, then the whiskey can take a bit more water. If it's a much older whiskey, you'd probably be recommended not to add much because it's so elegant and finely structured that you don't want to knock anything off balance. And so that's really sort of it. But I mean, from your personal enjoyment, it's just trial and error. You might, particularly with different whiskies, some whiskies, if you really like peated ones, they can take a lot more water a lot of the time. Whereas the lighter, the whiskies that we sort of call breakfast whiskies, they maybe take a little bit less water. So it's just really experimenting and finding out what sort of suits your palate.
Okay. And when we're thinking about, for the folks, I live close to Napa Valley. There's a lot of people who are snobby about wine around here. They'll talk to you about how you're even supposed to be holding your glass. What's like one of the things that'll tip people off that, hey, you don't know what you're talking about when we're sipping some Scotch here? What should you not do when you're having a drink with your friends?
Well, there is no right or wrong. I think okay. People in the industry have tried really hard to not have this or break down this sort of snobbery that was there, where it's like, oh my God, you cannot do that to your whiskey. But I think generally people wouldn't add if you're having a single malt whiskey, particularly an older one, you probably wouldn't add a soft drink to it. Okay. And ice, you can absolutely add ice if you want. But it would be perhaps quite a younger whiskey, a strong whiskey that you would add ice to, and you'd maybe only add, 1 or a couple of cubes. So I think personally, I wouldn't, with a single malt, I wouldn't add a.
Okay, is that a temperature thing, or is it like?
Yeah.
Okay.
It just like, yeah. exactly. Can destroy the flavors and aromas for a bit.
Okay. What's your favorite?
Oh gosh, I have a lot. So I really like the Islay ones. I love smoky whiskies, particularly ones like Ardbeg that just have this amazing complexity. But then I like totally unpeated ones as well. So, and I think that's what's great about single malt generally is there are so many variations, and you can really go down the route of I like this style of whiskey, but then you try another one that's completely different and you equally like it. So I think it's really hard, but from a sort of distillery background and story, I really like Ardbeg, obviously really like Glenmorangie, really like Glenfarclas. It's still family owned, same people as the founder back from 200 years ago, which I think is an amazing story. And there's lots of them that have fantastic stories, and so yeah, no, it's hard to sort of break it down to one brand.
Okay. If you showed up at a friend's house and they got out something, what's an example of something that would blow your mind? You're like, oh, I've always wanted to try that.
I think, oh gosh, that would be a really hard one. I think it would probably be, some of the old Ardbegs and the old Macallans. I think they would be amazing to try because at that time, this is sort of like in the 70s. I mean, you'll never recreate that spirit because things have changed so much. And so I think to taste, or even any whiskey back from that period where it wasn't a great time for Scotch whiskey industry. A lot of distilleries were closed, and then when they were reopened, they would just do mass volume, and then they'd mothball them again. But the whiskies from that period are, I mean, they sell for thousands and thousands. So I think to taste any whiskey from that decade would be amazing because it's before all the hype, and it was
Right.
just quite a sort of an honest process. So it would just be great to try one from then and see how different it is.
Cool. And what's the best whiskey event you feel like you've ever been to, and why was it so great?
So, gosh, it's hard to sort of narrow down one event. I think what I always get blown away by is when I go to whiskey festivals, and it's just the sheer volume of people. And sometimes and you go to master classes, and sometimes it's just a really basic master class with minimal props, just the whiskey and the blender in front of you or the distiller in front of you, and it's absolutely fantastic. So, and then you've been to other ones where there's lots of sort of showmanship and lots of dry ice and stuff like that. But actually, the ones that stick with you is just that really quite bare bones, just a class of 12 people, array of whiskies, and the blender standing there chatting to you about all the ones. So I think it's probably quite an unshowy whiskey event where you've had that interaction with the guy that's made the whiskey, and you've learned all the different nuances and the problems that they had trying to create that particular flavor or whatever it was. And I think that's really special to me and a lot of other sort of whiskey enthusiasts who follow the brands.
Okay. And I got another a nerdy question on the cask side of things. They talk a lot in the US with bourbons and things like that about these casks. Like basically they'll take casks that had scotch in them before, had wine in them before, and be using them to actually barrel all the different whiskeys that we've got here in the US, and that adds some sort of different flavor. Can you speak a little bit to that? What do you know about the reuse of the casks after they've been what's been bottled?
Yeah, so no, it's over here. It's sort of known as cask finishing, and it was started in the 80s by Balvenie and actually Glenmorangie, and well, there's two ways. Basically, Scotch is typically put into an ex sherry cask, so a cask that has had sherry in it beforehand, or an ex bourbon one which has had bourbon in it beforehand. And they're typically, we do use virgin oak, but much less because it's much more aggressive. So it's normally an ex-sherry or bourbon, and they add, like I said before, the different flavors. So the sherry, you'll get that sweet spice, sort of wintry, Christmassy notes, whereas bourbon, you'll get more sort of vanillins, more coconutty flavors coming through. But with the extra mature sort of wood finishing range, yep, they use rum, I think some beer casks, and port, different types of wine. And they all add, this is where your colour thing comes in. They can all add a huge element of colour, particularly some of the port ones, and totally different flavour notes. So what they will often do is have a whiskey that's been matured in, an ex-bourbon cask for, say, 8 years or 10 years, and then they will put it into a different cask for 6 months to 2 years to add that extra sort of layer of flavour and also help contribute to the colour. So dependent on what's been in the cask beforehand, it will all add certain flavours to the final product.
Cool. Okay, so one final question, then we'll open it up for questions from everyone else. But Edinburgh Whisky Academy, what are you trying to accomplish with it? What's the goal? What would you like to see happen over the next 10 years with it as well?
I set it up. The whole point when I set it up was really to create a company that was just focused around whiskey education for the consumer-facing side of the market and the enthusiasts, because obviously there was all the courses for distillers, but nothing for the sort of consumer-facing side. And the three key goals that I wanted to achieve was, one, that it was a recognised qualification. So with that, we're accredited by the Scottish Qualifications Authority, which is like our Scotland's sort of teaching qualifications, everything apart from university degrees. And second was that it's brand neutral, so that anyone who takes our courses know that it's not got any sort of marketing spin or brand narrative included in it. It's just completely factual. And the third was that the content is written and delivered by people who have actually done that job. So you're sort of going directly to the expert. What we would love to see is the sort of industry bodies implementing a sort of more structured training program for the consumer-facing side of the industry, along with, I think more support for hospitality, particularly here in Scotland, where there is quite a high turnover of staff. They don't typically earn a lot, but they are quite possibly for tourists, they'll be them that, they speak to about Scotch whisky. So it's really important that we, arm this sort of level of hospitality with good education around Scotch whisky. So I'd really hope to see more cooperation with the industry bodies and different places like that over the next sort of few years, which we're really trying to spearhead as well.
Great. Okay, well, thanks a ton, Kirsty. That was great discussion.